Hi, perhaps you recognize me. It's your favorite president.
We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come.
And if the yes vote is successful, we will be divided forever.
What does confrontation mean? It means you fight for what you believe.
We've got Trump-mania running this country, brother.
Unless you're scripted, you're useless.
I was saved by God to make America great again.
We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
G'day everyone, welcome back again to Commanding the Narrative. We just had a very successful interview with Tony Heller. It's a double shot today, double book, so that's always good. It's always good to cram in as many podcasts with some intelligent people as we can to try and get a lot of information out there. So hopefully you can join us for this second part of today. For this podcast. It was a great interview with Tony Heller. Hopefully this one will be equally as good. Now, to kick things off, I better let you know about Buy Me a Coffee. Now, if you want to support us, please head to Buy Me a Coffee. It helps to pay for the stream. It helps to pay for the website. And most importantly, I say it every time, it gives me a warm and fuzzy feeling inside. So Buy Me a Coffee is one way to do it. The other way to do it is by heading to the Commanding the Narrative website. You can click the donate button. Now, a lot of people not comfortable with Buy Me a Coffee for whatever reason. Some people like it, some people don't. If you don't like it, you can head to the website. There's more direct ways that you can donate to us there on the website. And while you're on the website, you might as well click the sign up button in the top right-hand corner. You'll get a weekly newsletter from me. I'm a bit behind on the newsletter this week because so much has been going on, but I will get to that very shortly. I don't like missing any weeks, but if you do get the newsletter, you get to keep up to date with all the podcasts that we do, any articles that I might write, and any events that are coming up. You can find it all on the website, or you can get the newsletter as well. Latest articles are here. Upcoming events are here. I better let you know about the Freedom Rally. It has been cancelled. We were promoting it here on Commanding the Narrative in recent weeks. Please don't go down to Canberra in February. That event has been cancelled for a number of different reasons, but unfortunately, we haven't been able to proceed with that event. But there'll be something other planned somewhere along the line, I'm sure. Now, also, Australians for Better Government is really heating up. We launched it at the start of the year. Members are slowly trickling in. Well, not slowly trickling in, consistently trickling in. We're having our first members meeting tomorrow. So if you want to sign up to be a member, please head to australiansforbetter.com, hit the join button. It's all about improving our system of government, thinking up ways of how we can improve and reform our system. It's from a grassroots level, not just relying on the politicians to do it, but for everyday Australians to pitch their ideas. And of course, as you know, Kevin Lockray is a big part of this. Membership is currently free. It's not going to stay that way. Probably in early February, we'll put a price tag on there. So be a foundation member, head to the website, and you can be a foundation member free of charge of Australians for Better Government. So please join us. And lastly, before we get to our interview, I just want to highlight Matthew Camanzuli. I was out in Fairfield yesterday to help launch his campaign. I completely endorse Matthew for the seat of McMahon. He's going to go up against Chris Bowen, and don't we know that we need to get rid of Chris Bowen? So please support Matthew. Head to his website, matthewcamanzuli.com. Sign up to be a volunteer. He's going to need as many volunteers as he possibly can. If you can contribute to his campaign via donations or volunteering in some sort of way, please do so. Head to his website and follow him on X. I know he was on Ben Fordham this morning. So right now we're going to have Gerard Holland on from the Page Research Centre. He's the CEO of the Page Research Centre. I just came across this gentleman. I've been very, very impressed by his work, and I'm sure this is going to be a fantastic interview. You might know him. He spoke recently at the ARC event here in Australia. Let's bring him on. Gerard, welcome to Commanding the Narrative.
Stephen, thanks so much for having me.
No, it's my pleasure. Maybe let's start off by just introducing yourself to the audience. Who is Gerard Holland?
G'day, I'm Gerard. I'm the CEO of the Page Research Centre, and Page is essentially a regional-based think tank that is sort of committed to those policy levers and drivers that will improve outcomes for rural and regional Australians. But we are firm believers that, with our regionally integrated economy, that better outcomes for the regions mean better outcomes for all of Australia. We sort of across a whole heap of policy issues, but I'd say sort of the big three that we're really sort of focusing on at the moment that I think are quite crucial to maintaining Australia's future prosperity. The first is defence and security, but particularly the security side of that equation. We're not so much into the guns and bullet stuff, we'll leave that to ASPI, but really looking at supply chain security, fuel security, food security. Are we able to get the supplies in that we need to keep this country running in crisis? The second big pillar, and has really been the focus of a lot of our work and attention recently, is looking at energy and productivity in the regions. Energy is the lifeblood of our society. It powers everything from your base inputs and digging it out of the ground all the way through to the end user or the end consumer in the supermarkets. And as energy prices keep going up, it's harder for business, it's harder for families, and the economy sort of groans under that strain. So really keenly focused on how we can get energy cheaper, but also looking at productivity, regulation, and those kind of levers that we can pull to really get our growth engine up and running. And the third kind of pillar is really looking at our social fabric, our culture. What are the citizens that we're raising? What is the next generation? What is our sense of civic duty, patriotism? How are we educating them? What's our family formation like? And these kind of questions that get to the heart of what does it mean to be Australian? Are we a country, or are we just an economic zone? And actually, for a country, different questions that you need to ask about how we really safeguard our social fabric and really have a citizenry that's thriving and optimistic and hopeful about what the future can hold.
That's all fantastic. And I should let the audience know, I'll put the link to StreamYard in the chat. If you want to call in and ask Gerard a question or maybe make a comment, please do so. We also always love hearing our feedback from the audience. But I've spoken to a lot of people in rural communities. I'm living in the northern beaches of Sydney. I'm in a teal electorate. I'm Zali Steggall's electorate. I'm surrounded by teals. I've got Sophie Scamps to the north. I've got Allegra Spender to the south. Kylie Tink was in North Sydney. That's been abolished, but it looks like the teals are going to go hard in Bradfield as well. But I've been speaking to people out in parks, out in Coolah and Dunedoo, and people in these renewable energy zones that are seeing their agricultural land being torn up with wind turbines and solar panels and high voltage transmission lines. Their property rights are being eroded. They're not getting any say on, and then most importantly, they don't feel represented in government. And a big part of that is because electorates like Parkes is a third of New South Wales, where you've got all these city electorates congested in Sydney with a host of politicians. And I've just mentioned all the teals. That's in a very small area. You've got four of them there, all contributing to votes in Parliament. But then they're propagating policies that directly affect rural communities. So they're pushing a reduction of emissions by 75% by 2035. They want no more coal. They want no more gas. They want to push ahead with solar and wind. But, and I've brought this up so many times on the podcast and in speeches, and I'll keep drumming this home because I think people need to hear this over and over again. Just head to Zali Steggall's website. And if you click on her policy page and where she stands for, she says it in black and white: I do not support wind farms along Warringa's beachfront. And then she goes on to say, it's unfortunate that such an important issue as the climate crisis is trivialized by some and reduced to my personal use of solar panels, the car I drive, and a joke petition to put windmills on Manly Beach. Now, it may be a joke for Zali. It's not a joke for people living in rural communities that have to face this stuff. How do you feel from the Page Research Centre perspective when it comes to rural people? Are they adequately represented?
Look, it's a really interesting point, and I think one of the kind of lodestars of why Page exists and why we're doing the work that we're doing is, if you look at Australia's exports, these are the industries that are actually bringing the money into the country, that are digging things up, manufacturing things, shipping them out. Overwhelmingly, 60-70% of those are in the regions, be that in mining, agriculture, tourism. But when you look at the way that our economy is made up, 30% of our GDP is now tied up in the public sector. And these are, this perfectly mirrors with the fact that 85% of our population lives on the eastern seaboard, and all of those populations are concentrated in Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane. So you have a situation where all the money is being made in the bush, but all the decisions are being made in inner cities. And this disconnect is actually why we're seeing productivity lag. It's why we're now in a per capita recession, because we've had no real growth for quite a long time now. It's why energy prices keep on increasing. It's why you're seeing industry after industry shut down and pack up and go overseas because they can't compete, be it with Asia or even the US. And so this kind of disconnect is one of the reasons why we're getting such broken policy outcomes. And in the US and their electoral college, they at least nominally have a way of addressing this. It's you have all of the Rust Belt, all of those flyover states. They still have a voice at the table, and of course here we have One Nation. We have the Nats. They have a couple of senators and a couple of MPs, but there isn't that same mechanism that ensures that regional people have a proportionate voice in decision making as the contribution that they make to the economy. And this is why independent think tanks are so important. IPA does amazing work, CIS does amazing work, Menzies does great work, Australian Institute for Progress in Queensland, but all of these are metropolitan based think tanks who are primarily looking at metropolitan issues. And so that's why Page is really trying to fill that gap and sort of articulate what regional people need. And it goes beyond some of the stuff that you might get from our politicians. And yes, of course, we want more money for roads and more money for black spots and that kind of thing, but actually getting to the heart of resilience, industrial policy, our manufacturing capacity, energy, that's where Page is really trying to value add in the space.
See, I would love to see state governments abolished and also local governments abolished and move to regional governments. I think that would solve a lot of the issues. I don't think that's going to happen because how you convince state governments to abolish themselves, it would have to be a complete grassroots, independent, people's movement for that to happen. I don't think we're a long way from getting there. But has Page Research Centre done any proposals or worked on any ideas on how to better represent people in the bush?
Well, look, I know the National Party had their big decentralisation agenda, and that was really sort of championed by Barnaby Joyce. And it's interesting, if you go back through the archives, a lot of former Nats leaders have sort of lamented that what we need is new states or sort of prosecuted that agenda. There is actually an interesting body of research, and that it's fairly niche Australian history, but actually when Australia was first federated, that wasn't meant to be the end point. The idea was that as regions grew and developed, that Australia would federate into more states. And we actually had a referendum in New South Wales back in, I think, the late 60s to have New England break off as its own independent state from New South Wales. But we had a Labor state government at the time, a Labor federal government. They basically gerrymandered the borders of the vote to include Newcastle and the Hunter, which was a very safe Labor area. And the referendum just went down. I think it was like a 52 to 48 or something, like a really close margin. And if you took Newcastle out of that referendum, it would have got up, and we'd already have a new state of New England. So, whether we'll revisit that debate in our lifetime, I'm not really sure. But, Matt Canavan up in Queensland, he's often spruiking that far north Queensland should break off and have independence from Brisbane. And I do think these ideas are worth taking seriously. You actually do have a lot of regional industries up there, a lot of production, a lot of the state's production, but they have no autonomy over taxation, over regulation, over labour movement, all of these kind of issues that really shape their livelihoods. And so whether it's new states or actually just groups like Page and other groups and other prominent figures just articulating these needs, there's still so much more that needs to be done.
I've heard it said that New South Wales stands for Newcastle, Sydney and Wollongong, the NSW, but it is a big part of the problem. And I think a lot of the view in Sydney is that if these rural areas were to break away and form their own states, then they'd be unsustainable. The economic hubs are in Sydney and all the financial districts are in Sydney, and the rural communities wouldn't be able to support themselves. But what you're saying is the complete opposite to that. You're saying a lot of the wealth generation in this country is coming from those rural areas. So in your view, would they, if we just drew a line and said, well, I know David Landini, who I've interviewed before, he's talking about the Riverina becoming its own state. You mentioned New England. If these areas were to become their own states, could they support themselves?
So Look, I wasn't expecting to be having this conversation, to be honest. This is
Neither was I, but this is
I bet I'll be in mind that I think my board would regale in horror if they thought this is all we're doing. But look, just to entertain the thought experiment, Tasmania's got 600,000 population. Far north Queensland got 1.2 million people. So, and then the amount of wealth and productivity that far north Queensland produces absolutely dwarfs that of Tasmania. So, there is the precedent in our smaller states, Tasmania, South Australia, when you actually look at their population size versus their legislative power and seat at the table, we already have a system that's a bit out of whack. I suppose the other way of looking at it is New South Wales and Victoria, or should I say Sydney and Melbourne, have are sort of overrepresented in decision making compared to the amount of value that they produce for the economy. WA is another state, massive state, tiny city in perspective, and they've managed to govern themselves okay. Of course, there'd be teething problems. You want to set up any institutional infrastructure. Where are you setting the capital? Where are you getting the civil servants from? But these aren't insurmountable hurdles, and they aren't really massive barriers, to be honest. There's incredible people out in the bush, there's incredible universities out in the bush, there's incredible students, and actually one of the big problems is we have a brain drain where the bush is raising all these bright young sparks, but they're heading to the cities for what is perceived as more opportunity, and so actually start to put public service in some of these regional hubs, and I think you'd end up with some very different outcomes. But look, I think what it highlights is there's this general feeling that the system isn't quite working how it should. And if it was, we wouldn't be seeing poorer outcomes in just about every metric. And I think if you're looking at, white male median wage is pretty much flatlined since about the 80s. A bit of movement in the early 2000s, but not a whole lot. If you look at the price of energy, in real terms, it's increased 67% since 2007. And of that, 59% happened just in the last 10 years. We're seeing our aluminium smelters close. We're seeing our oil refineries close. We now only have 1 or 2 refineries left. We have nowhere near enough fuel storage in country. I think our strategic reserve is in the US, which is just absolutely absurd when you think the most likely crisis in our region is directly between us and the US. How do you actually get the fuel in? And we sort of had tastes of this, but we have very short memory spans. I don't know if you recall, last year we ran out of IV bags in hospitals because then we weren't stockpiling. We weren't thinking about how do we actually get these supplies in. And as it turns out, most of the critical supplies that we do rely on will come from one manufacturer, and that's China. And there is a worry when the most likely flashpoint in our region in the next decade is probably going to be China, whether it's over Taiwan, whether it's with the Philippines, whether it's with Japan or South Korea, whether it's with India. That is all the geostrategic analysts recognise that in our region, that's where the most likely crisis lies. And so you're now seeing our largest trading partner, who we are most dependent on for all of our critical mineral refinery, all of our medical supplies, all of our white goods. That is not a strong or confident position to be in, and I really haven't seen Canberra address this or take this seriously, or the media take this seriously, and I think that's something as well. We just got to keep sort of banging the gong on and just try and raise awareness, and actually, if you start to take in these regional perspectives, you don't need to start new states, but just start listening. That would be a good start.
Yes, well, that is a good point. A lot of these issues are coming from poor leadership and bad government. Energy policy is really at the tip of the spear in a lot of ways when it comes to a lot of the issues that we're facing here in this country, whether it be high energy prices or a loss of manufacturing, or we can go on and on and on. The federal elections coming up, Peter Dutton and the coalition are going to go to the election with a nuclear policy. So this is going to be a big part of the debate. To bring up Zali Steggall again, she was on Sky News recently. And of course, as I said, the Teals are going to be pushing back against the nuclear policy, and because they want renewables and what have you. She said the idea that we need this baseload is an antiquated idea. Our grid is evolving and changing. We are now, with smart technology and appliances, able to meet the needs of the grid by turning on and off as required on demand. The idea, the old-fashioned concept of baseload power, is proving to be more and more a thing of the past, And we have to stop thinking that we're investing for the future to replicate the past. What we need is policies that meet the current reality, and that's where the coalition plan just fails. Now, you do a lot of research at Page on nuclear. You've got a policy submission that you've come up with. You've done a lot of research in this area. What do you have to say when Zali Steggall says that baseload power is antiquated?
You know, it's I don't want to dig the boot in too much, because she's clearly not across her brief and just doesn't actually understand how grid works. And it is very easy to sort of read the PR and the spin and the press releases from battery technology companies and all of these different organisations that prop up basically as like parasites seeking out government funding in order to get their stuff up and running. And you know, it's interesting. One of the questions that I get asked the most, probably, whenever I present some of our research and findings on energy policies, are who funds you? And it's almost like, if we can find this smoking gun and find out that, you know, fossil fuel gave you money, then we can completely disregard everything that you've said. And you know, proudly, my biggest supporter is actually the Australian taxpayer. We get a grant from the government annually that pays my salary. But just
to cut in quickly, sorry to cut you off, but this is a big part of the Teals campaign. I know one of the previous podcasts that we did, Richard Storch read out an email that Sophie Scamps had sent out saying, you know, we're getting attacked by the coal lobby, and the coal lobby is doing this, and they're putting so much funding. I'm like, well, if the coal lobby is that powerful and they've got this direct line to government, why are we not building new coal plants? We're instead blowing them up. So obviously the coal lobby is not.
We haven't built one since 2007, and this is the croniest and corporate state we're in. Is actually the big industry at the moment is renewables. You know, all of the industry super funds have massive investments in renewables. Who the industry super funds propped up by? Well, who do they prop up? The Labor Party. You got Wayne Swan, obviously former Deputy Prime Minister and Treasurer, as the head of CBUS Super. You've got the Green, I think it's the Green Finance Corporation, which is a massive government investor. They put in $1 or $2 billion in the last 2 years, and are committed to another $10 billion over the next couple of years in investing in explicitly renewable technology. You've got AEMO and CSIRO, who basically mark the government's homework and feel that their responsibility is to deliver government policy in the cheapest way possible, as opposed to critique or independently review government policy. And then globally, you've got these kind of climatist think tanks, over 5-6 billion annually, swashing around to sort of promote the kind of climate scare and hysteria around this existential threat, completely flying in the face of IPCC reports and actually observe phenomena that's happening on the ground. So all of this creates this huge actual echo chamber of pro-renewables, anti-nuclear propaganda. And then, of course, you know, all these companies have signed up to these ESG mandates, so they feel the need to performatively engage in the debates. They put out press releases about how they're going green, and press releases how they're backing off certain technologies. And then this creates this ecosystem which is completely disconnected from reality. And the reality is, we fundamentally need baseload power. You cannot power a modern industrialized economy without baseload power. And to Zali's observations that we have all these smart appliances now, and we can just dial up and dial down and turn on and off. This is coming back to a fundamental perspective and really way of viewing the world. Is, do you see human beings as being the central locus of what's important, and actually how do we maximize human flourishing? How do we lift as many people up out of poverty? How do we make ourselves as wealthy as possible, not because greed is good, but because it is through wealth that we access opportunity and education and able to unleash our own capabilities and capacities? Or do you have this view that human beings are parasites, that we're cancers, that we consume way too much, that we're in this existential crisis, and that it's really quite an anti-human ideology, that we need to get rid of the humans, we all need to sacrifice in order to protect this kind of virgin, perfect in harmony Mother Nature planet? And what Zali's articulating is, well, if we just use less electricity, then we wouldn't have to rely on baseload power. But why do we have to use less electricity? We should be constantly asking, how do we use more electricity? How do we produce more electricity, cheaper, more abundant, more resilient, more secure, and still maintain our responsibilities to the natural environment? And that's the story of human history. Is we went from dirty biofuels like burning timber, burning peat, which were toxic, which were labor intensive. Huge swaths of forest. Half of Europe was chopped down pretty much up until the Industrial Revolution, when they were able to stop because they transitioned to coal, to these denser fuels that are more efficient, that are scalable, that are cheaper, that are more abundant. Then we go from coal, we go to oil to gas. The next step on this trajectory is nuclear. As we're going along, we're using more electricity, we're unleashing more potential, more prosperity, and actually we're stewarding the environment better and better and better. There's more there's more forest in Europe than I think in the last 1 or 2,000 years. The polar bear populations are actually increasing. Like, wealth means that rather than trying to survive, you can allocate resources towards stewardship of our natural environment. And so I think her fundamental perspective is completely different to where I would come at this. And I'd be asking, how do we make energy cheaper? And then how do we use more energy? Not how do we restrict people's freedoms and restrict the access that people have to the technologies that they should have a right to afford, assuming that they're living as part of a system that's operating, functionally.
Well, there's these ideas floating around about virtual power stations where you might have your Tesla charging in the driveway, and then the grid somehow magically takes power out of your Tesla to use it elsewhere, and almost using your car as a battery. I mean, these are the crazy ideas that are flying around. And as you said, Zali's talking about using less energy. Well, the world is not moving that direction. The world is moving into the direction of AI and cryptocurrency, which is going to be using huge amounts of energy. We're moving into an energy famine, if anything. Now would be the time more than ever to embrace baseload power. And by introducing all these intermittent energy sources into the mix, you're creating a lot of havoc. This is the AEMO website. This is the current energy mix in New South Wales right now. As you can see, the sun's shining, it's the middle of the day. Solar's currently producing 45% of our energy. Coal, which is quite high, I've never seen it that high before, but I guess it is the middle of summer. Coal's producing 43%. Now, the big problem is you can't turn coal plants off easily. They need to stay operational. They have to keep running, because when the sun goes down in a few hours' time, you're not going to be able to rely on that 45% of solar. And we just know that batteries aren't up to the task. And plus, these lithium batteries are combustible, and who knows what could happen there. So you have to keep the coal plants running. They're producing excess energy. It's going into the ground in a lot of cases. It's pushing up the cost of coal, thus pushing up our electricity prices. So that's one part of the problem, increased energy prices. But where do you get the energy when the sun goes down and the wind's not blowing?
Well, this is how this energy debate has become so distorted, is that there's two fundamental drivers on your energy bill. And the first one is, the capital expenditure. It's how much does it actually cost to build the infrastructure that you need in order to generate the electricity you want. And the best analogy I can think of is, like, if I want to start a cafe, how much does it cost to buy the building, to buy my coffee machine, to buy my beans, maybe labor hire and a couple of other things? How much does it actually cost to get it all up and running? But then the second part of that equation, which actually I think our debate has been quite juvenile and infantile in this country, and this is things that, like, the CSIRO's Gen Cost report doesn't address, is how do you develop a market around those costs in order to price it in a way that gives you a return on investment, so that you're not losing money, but it's actually profitable and sustainable. So back to our cafe, how many coffees do you need to sell? And how do you price those coffees in order to pay off the infrastructure that you've invested in? Now, most of the debate that we've had has been around what's the cost of the infrastructure, and particularly how much does it cost just to build the asset? And already that debate has been incredibly stunted, because there's four crucial considerations that Labor and the teals and Gen Cost just refuse to acknowledge. The first is, how do you actually get the electricity from where it's generated to the end user? So this is all of your transmission lines, and this is the distribution system in your streets. And as you decentralize the grid, it gets so much more expensive. And classic example, if you're generating electricity in the Res and Dubbo, you need all the power lines into Sydney, which is going to be the main consumer, but then you also have to send it down to Snowy Hydro for when you're producing excess. And then when it's not producing enough in Dubbo, it then has to get pumped up back from Snowy Hydro into Sydney. So you're creating this incredibly vast and expensive interconnected grid that needs its own maintenance and replacements and all the rest. So first, how do you get the energy from go to woe? The second thing is, how you have your nameplate capacity, which is how much is on the tin it can potentially produce, how much electricity, but then there's how much do you expect that it will actually produce. And solar renewables have a very, very low capacity factor. So if I put in, say, 10 gigawatts of solar, I can actually only expect 2 to 3 gigawatts at any given time. Unlike something like coal, which you can run at 60, 70, 80, 90%, or nuclear, where you can run at 95%, no worries. So again, if you're 10 gigawatts of solar and 10 gigawatts of coal are not like for like, you really have to say 30 gigawatts of solar to match that output of 10 gigawatts of coal. So that's the second thing. The third thing then is, what's the time frame of these assets? How often do they have to be replaced? And if you've got a nuclear reactor that can last 60 to 80 years, a coal-fired power plant can last 40 to 50 years, okay, you only have to build that infrastructure once. Solar panels, wind turbines, they have to be replaced every 20, 30 years. And then on the way to that period, the capacity factor drops down because the solar cells lose their power. So you have an asset that's producing less output the older it gets, and needs to be replaced several times along that journey. And then the fourth part of this equation, when you think about the whole capital expenditure, the system cost, is, as you mentioned, what do you do when it's not producing electricity? So how do you firm this grid? And if you're firming with gas, well, then you need to go and build gas turbines, and you need to have enough gas in reserve that can jump in a moment's notice. If you're building batteries, well, you need batteries, and you need enough battery storage to store enough for, say, 2 or 3 days of low solar in the middle of winter, or maybe 2 weeks of low solar in the middle of winter, maybe enough for a 2-week wind drought. So you need the scale of the batteries that you need. And all these dams and hydro projects. And Snowy Hydro, again, it's blown out to what, 12, 13, 14 billion dollars. This doesn't generate electricity, it just stores electricity. So these four factors, and once you look at the full system cost over the lifespan of, say, a nuclear power plant, 60 years, you can see that renewables come out at about 1.5 trillion, 2 trillion if you don't include any gas. Nuclear comes out at about 800 billion, factoring in fuel, waste storage, staffing costs and everything else. And coal comes in at about 500 billion. So there's clear cost comparisons to be made on your capital expenditure. And then to the other part of the equation, and excuse me for rambling, but
no, go for it.
The other really important consideration is then, as I mentioned, how do you take that system and then design a market around it? And as a good rule of thumb, you want a small amount of machines doing most of the work most of the time is a system that will always be cheaper than lots and lots and lots of machines only working part of the time. I'll give you a classic example of this. So we build all these batteries, right? So a couple of million a battery here, there, everywhere. But they only come online in that gap between the low solar output and the low wind output. So you've got 45 minutes, an hour and a half that they're required. How do you price an asset that costs $4 or $5 million that only generates electricity for an hour a day? And so what happens is that electricity becomes incredibly valuable because you're not actually flattening out the supply in the system. You're now saying, if you don't turn this battery on right now, the whole grid will collapse. And that battery operator says, well, I have to make my money back in the 10 years that I have this asset, and you need this electricity desperately. The only way I can cover my costs is to price this per megawatt accordingly. So all these huge spikes, like we experienced in New South Wales a couple of months ago, we got up to $16,000, $17,000 per megawatt for about an hour or so. If you put in more batteries, it's just going to exacerbate that problem. The other problem with renewables is, because they're weather dependent, you don't actually smooth out the supply over the course of the day. Each additional renewable that you build is competing with what's already been built into the grid. So if I build 20 more solar panels, it now means I'm producing 20 times more electricity, all at the exact same time, which means the value of that electricity plummets. Now, again, if I've built that solar panel, how do I price my electricity in a way that protects my investment if each new entrant into the market actually just drives my profit margin lower? And that's where the subsidies come in. About 10% of your bill is generation certificates, either small scale for rooftop solar or large scale for the big generators. Essentially, the taxpayer subsidizes and gives a guaranteed price to these renewable generators to make it economically viable. So the more that we push in these peak times, it's just going to be the more providers that we have to subsidize in order to keep all of them cash flow positive to pay off their assets, whilst we're still creating these pinch points. And as you mentioned before, that traditional baseload power, if you've got your coal-fired power plant that could be running all day, 70, 80%, you work out your long-run marginal cost over 40 years to pay off that asset, Bob's your uncle. Instead, now it's cycling on and off, running at much lower capacity factor, despite the fact that you've got this expensive infrastructure that's just sitting there. And so again, now the price of your coal gets more expensive in your grid, and your cost of your gas gets more expensive in your grid, and on and on and on and on and on. Yep. So it's the more renewables that go into the grid, they will only push up power bills higher and higher and higher, because we're thinking only about that one input. We're not thinking about how a market responds to the way that we're generating electricity. So this idea that we don't need baseload is like just a complete fallacy, and it's just someone who's never actually spoken to an engineer or an economist, or even understands how their power bill is made up. So that's I think the crucial misunderstanding of this debate.
Mate, that was fantastic, and I'd love to hear you debate people like Chris Bowen or Zali Steggall or any of these characters running around, because you're probably right. They're just reading the publications or the glossy brochures that they're getting from these renewable companies, and they're just running with that. They're not actually looking deeply into it. And one of the things I love doing is going to polling booths and just having discussions with the teal supporters. And one in particular I was talking to, we're talking about solar panels in rural communities and how he feels about that. And he says, well, Australia's got a lot of desert. We can just put the solar panels there. The problem is, they're not putting them in the desert. They're putting them on agricultural.
And you come back to that same problem. How do you get the electricity from the desert back to the East Coast?
Yes.
And then how do you build them? How do you get the trucks out there? How do you get all the infrastructure? How do you get the concrete pours when they need maintenance? When you have a sandstorm and they all get covered in dust, how are you? And this is it's this.
Or hailstorms and they get wiped out.
Or a hailstorm. It's this really kind of childish, infantilized perspective of the deep complexities of a system. And this is one of the challenges of whenever you have a centralized system that's purely dictated by bureaucrats or the state, is that there are so many different perspectives that knock out bad ideas. And when you have a flourishing market, it's not just about the good ideas rising to the top, it's about the bad ideas drown and flounder away. When the state has too big a stake in designing and planning some of these ideas, and I'm not saying we don't have the state, there obviously needs to be some direction. We can't have competing energy grids with one another. But when you aren't factoring in these market forces into your decision making, it means that bad ideas go around and around and around and around and around. And the solution to these bad ideas is more taxpayer money, more subsidies, more regulation, push out the competitors. And this is what's happened with coal. Is the reason we're not building coal is because we've made it illegal to build coal. We've set up all these regulations that have said, either you'll get taxed to death, or you won't be able to find any capital, because I think 90% of banks in New South Wales won't even lend to thermal coal producers anymore. And so we've created this really quite toxic business and political environment that means that the good ideas aren't losing because they've been tested. They're losing because bureaucrats and DEI departments have decided, no, we can't go down this direction.
Yeah. No, I was in the NAB the other day, and they had this big, massive poster on the wall with a wind turbine, basically saying that they weren't going to fund any more coal projects and they were only going to back renewable projects, and they completely agree with the Paris Accord. But look, we've talked about the teals, and we've talked about people like Bowen and the people that are propagating these things. Let's take them out of the equation for a minute, because the Page Research Centre has put out this inquiry into nuclear. It's a very comprehensive document. I actually want to focus on coal versus nuclear. We've got coal currently. We seem to be moving towards nuclear. What is your view on that? Are there benefits to having both, maybe?
Yeah, I'm very much sort of tech neutral on these things, and I come out quite anti-renewables, not because I hate renewables, but because I can't seem to find an equation where renewables make sense in a grid where you allow a mixture of coal, gas, and nuclear. I think if you want immediate price pressure, it's hard not to see how coal is the way to do that. Ultra critical coal at the mine mouth, as close as possible to the consumer. That just is the cheapest way to generate electricity over a 24-hour period, 365 days of the year. There's nothing unique about Australia's conditions that defy the laws of physics and engineering that every single other nation around the world recognises, and coal's the cheapest way to do it. And per gigawatt, over the short run, coal is the cheapest way to do that. Having said that, I think there's a really important place for nuclear in our grid. And that's, again, once you look at the life cycle over this asset, the long run marginal cost of nuclear is actually very, very appealing. The thing is, it's a lot of capital investment up front, but you're getting an asset that lasts 60, 80, KEPCO are now saying that they can extend these reactors over 100 years. That's low cost electricity. We've got so much uranium here in Australia. We've got 30% of the world's supply. All of the industries that could sprout up around nuclear, the enormous economic benefit for communities. Going nuclear will pay off, and it will pay off a lot quicker than I think people appreciate. A lot of the cases against nuclear, and especially talking about their price and the short run marginal cost of that, again, they're based on assuming an 80% renewable grid by 2030. And so they're saying, oh, you could only operate at 30 or 40% capacity factor, because what are you going to do with all the renewables? And for me, you don't design an expensive grid just because that's what the piece of paper says. You should design the cheapest possible grid, and that is more coal in the short term, and then in the medium term, we need nuclear power. And I think a mixture of both. I think a coal to nuclear transition makes a lot of sense. I think we start building coal-fired power stations now, we start building nuclear power stations now, and then over the course of a couple of decades, we transition to a grid that is mostly nuclear dominated with a much cheaper price per kilowatt.
See, this is one of the big criticisms that people have of Peter Dutton. They say, yeah, he's moving towards nuclear, but he still supports net zero and we're still going to see renewables. But look, strategically, he can't come out and attack renewables head on, because he's just going to get so much blowback by all the people that we've mentioned, the renewable lobby and everything that comes along with that. Whereas the stark reality is, if he was to introduce nuclear energy into the grid, there wouldn't be any need for renewables. It just completely, that they would just fall over. They wouldn't be necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. It's if your primary concern is to decarbonize Australia's energy grid, nuclear is quite literally the only option. Building in a whole heap of renewables, once you factor in all of the embedded emissions that went into mining them, refining them, manufacturing them, shipping them here, the concrete pours, etc., they only reduce emissions from coal by about 40%. So renewables are not the zero solution. They are a 40% better solution if carbon dioxide emissions are the sole purpose of why you're designing an energy grid, which I think is a terrible idea, but for a whole heap of reasons we can get into if that's helpful. If you want low carbon electricity, nuclear is the only way that you can get there. There is no carbon emissions produced when you generate electricity by nuclear power. They are very small, dense sites, so much less concrete needed than with renewables, less concrete needed than with coal. It is overwhelmingly the lowest carbon solution. Now, I don't think low carbon is the only way that you should be designing a grid. For mine, there's multiple considerations. You want, firstly, cheap as possible, because the cheaper the electricity is, the more industry, the more industriousness, the more innovation that can sprout around economies with cheap energy. So no matter what your ambition is, if it's environmentalism, if it's getting more kids into school, if it's better healthcare, whatever it is, cheap energy is how you get there. We need reliable electricity, and this comes back to, you can't have electricity that's dependent on the weather, and you can't have electricity that is dependent upon our hostile adversaries across the sea. You need domestic energy security, and so again, coal and nuclear give you that. You need, to when you're thinking about stewarding the natural environment, you can't just think about carbon emissions. You have to think about land use. You have to think, how is this damaging our waterways? How is this damaging our prime agricultural land? How is this damaging our national parks? What is the land use impact? What is the amount of minerals and core components that go into producing this electricity? And again, you cannot get denser electricity than nuclear as far as its impact on the natural environment. So when we look at a holistic framework, for me, it's coal and nuclear come out on top with gas for thermal.
I was recently speaking to a French politician, Charles Henry Gallas, and I had to ask him about nuclear, because I know France produces so much of its power from nuclear. And I said, is it true that 70% of your power comes from nuclear? He said, no, it's actually 80%, and it would be 100% if the EU wasn't enforcing renewables upon us. So he was right in favor. And then he went on to tell me that their recycling technology now means that from all the waste that they have accumulated throughout the decades, they've got 2,000 years worth of energy sitting there that they can repurpose. They would not have to dig up any more uranium or an ounce of uranium to power their reactors for the next 2,000 years. And that got me investigating it. I actually wrote an article in The Spectator about it. And I found this company, Orano, in France, which is doing the exact thing. They're repurposing nuclear waste and reusing it. And interestingly, one of its clients is Australia. So our Lucas Heights reactor is already recycling its nuclear fuel. So there's tremendous opportunities there. Are you concerned about nuclear waste? A lot of people are concerned about that. What's your view?
Nuclear waste is a solved problem. And I think one of the big problems is when people think about nuclear, they think about The Simpsons, and they think about these big glowing barrels of goo. But the vast majority of the mass, of nuclear waste, the stuff that's actually in the 40-gallon drums, those are the gloves, the costumes, the safety protection equipment that people wear around the factories. Now, most of this is because of regulation and bureaucracy. It's not because of any danger, because of radiation. I think the reactors are so locked in, and there's so much dense concrete and other protective factors around them. I think famously, you get more radiation from a banana than you would standing directly over a nuclear reactor. So when you think of the volume of waste, this is the stuff the workers are wearing around, and there's very, very, very low radioactivity to this stuff. When you think about the actual fuel itself, the spent fuel, not the glowing barrels of goo, but what it actually looks like, they're tiny chips about the size of my thumbnail. And over the course of one of our lives, the entire electricity that we would use, those chips would fit in a Coke can. It is incredibly...
We've got one right
here. Oh,
here.
you've got one there. Okay, so you're all over this. Exactly right. It's an incredibly dense fuel. It's safe. What most countries are doing, literally is like putting them underground, put them in a sealed concrete container. The biggest thing for that is like stop someone accidentally like walking over, tripping over it, cracking it open, and like giving it a taste. Like it's a solved problem, but we have these kind of pop cultural ideas of what the spent fuel looks like. And as you said, these next generation reactors, they're actually looking at now taking that spent fuel from older reactors and then giving them another go around and cracking more energy out of them. And so there's perpetual energy for tens and tens and tens of thousands of years already sitting there waiting to be utilized and repurposed. And this isn't a problem that it needs to be like, in the desert 40 kilometers down in a bomb shelter. It's the Lucas Heights waste sit there for about 3 or 5 years before they actually get it there, and they put it in a car and then ship it to the port and then send it over to France. And a lot of people don't realize that it's right in the heart of the Shire. House prices in Cronulla haven't gone down. No one's walking around with 2 heads around Miranda Shopping Centre because of the Lucas Heights reactor. It's just a media beat up, and Labor recognise this as well. That they're not saying it's unsafe. No one uses that rhetoric anymore. It's risky. It's risky. Going nuclear would be risky, and it's you can just tell they've done all this focus testing, and because it doesn't really mean anything, because you pin them down. What does risky mean? Oh, well, it might be more expensive. Oh, it might be unreliable. Oh, we might not be able to build them in time. They've come up with this sort of term that kind of gives you the feeling that it's unsafe without them saying something that they know is demonstratively not true.
Well, they did put out that video recently of the lady talking about how being close to a nuclear plant increases cancer. So there are a little bit of a scare campaign happening with Labor from the Labor side. But look, I think we've made the case for nuclear. There's a lot of other issues to talk about as well. You actually hosting Reality Bites recently. You were talking about the economy, and you were saying that Australia is already in a per capita recession. There's a lot of contributing issues towards that, which you detailed in this. It was very impressive, I must say. We talked about energy policy, but what are some of the other issues that are contributing to our economic woes at the moment?
So I'd say there's probably 3. Obviously with all these issues, it gets really complex, and you start looking at the structural makeup of our economy. But if you're looking at a top level, I think there's 3 issues that need to be addressed yesterday that have been contributing to this. And the first one is, of course, energy policy, and we don't need to revisit everything we've been talking about, but it is one of the core inputs into our economy. And as long as your energy is getting more expensive, it means that it becomes much harder to make things and produce things. And productivity is much easier in an economy that makes things than in a service-based economy where you're either serving coffees or you're sitting there typing on laptops. And Australia is transitioning, or has transitioned from an economy that makes things into economy that is based on services. And so you just won't see the productivity gains that continue to see the increase in living standards that we would like to see. And one of the core reasons for that is energy policy. Next one is regulation. The red, green, and black tape that is absolutely strangling our primary and secondary industries, the levels of compliance, the levels of activism and green warfare. I think there's about $67 billion in projects that are either being challenged or being tied up by environmental defenders officers and green lawfare at the moment. We've actually got a report unpacking some of these issues coming out next week. So a little plug for that, a complex and costly web, the burden on our regional businesses. So I would encourage your listeners to jump on the page website next Thursday when that comes out. So, but just recognise there's so much capital that's being tied up, and it deters investment. If I'm sitting there and I've got $50 and I could put it into Australia, or I could put it into the US, or I could put it into China, I'm going to go to the place where there's the least burden, the least compliance, the least barriers set in my way that are going to stop that from being a successful project. We want other people's money from countries coming in here into our country that local jobs can sprout up. That's how countries make money. It's by selling things and getting other people to park their money here, and we're just deterring investment. I mean, Queensland has, I think, the highest coal royalties in the world. Across Australia, our wine equalisation tax is by far the highest in the world. It's about 30%. We're just making ourselves completely uncompetitive. Third driver, I think I said three, but I guess there's four. The third driver is the amount we're spending. You know, interest rates aren't coming down because the government is spending cash like it's going out of fashion. This money is not being sucked up in tax revenue. This money is being put on the tab, and it's our generation and our kids, and goodness, if this country's still here, our grandkids who are going to be footing that bill. And the problem is, when you have a situation like we do, where productivity is so low, where there has been this stagnation for a good 10, 15 years, you can't bank on the fact that there's going to be some magical breakthrough that all of a sudden we're going to get super rich in 10 years' time, and then our ability to repay that debt is going to magically transform. It is so irresponsible to be growing debt, to be spending money we don't have at a time when productivity is so low, and we're transitioning again towards a service-based economy where you can expect those productivity gains to continually decrease. And all these big innovations that people are hoping that AI and these data centers and things are happening, they're going to happen in the places where they've got cheap electricity to power them. And that is not Australia. You know, we aren't going to ride the wave of crypto and AI and all that kind of thing. What's going to happen is we're going to plug our computer in, and then someone overseas is going to be reaping those benefits. So that's the third thing. The fourth thing is all of this has been masked by mass migration. And rather than actually doing the hijacker of reform, addressing some of the structural imbalances within our economy, we just keep bringing people in, and then that artificially pumps up demand while we got constricted supply. And so, you know, every single person you bring in puts more pressures on housing, it puts more pressure on infrastructure, puts more pressure on our hospitals. It creates this artificial demand for the consumption of goods. Meanwhile, living standards continue to lower and lower and lower. And once you account for this mass migration, that's where you realize that we are actually already in a per capita recession. Living standards are decreasing, purchasing power is decreasing, rents are going up, house prices are going up, productivity is falling, but you know, again, Chalmers can walk out and say, look how great everything's going, because we just keep opening the door to this never-ending influx of economic migrants. And, you know, every construction worker we bring in to solve the housing crisis, that means we need another doctor, another policeman, another plumber, another electrician, another school teacher. And this is you can never import enough people to fill your skill shortage, because every person you bring in has their own needs, their own kind of goods and systems and processes they need to tap into. And this is why you create this kind of deck of cards that self-perpetuates and actually makes it worse and worse and worse and worse and worse.
You talked about productivity. People are not encouraged to work harder. The more I get paid by the hour. The more hours that I work pushes me up into the higher bracket of tax. So I get taxed more, and you don't see any more in your pocket. So where's the incentive for people to contribute to the productivity of the nation? Because Albanese decided not to introduce the stage 3 tax cut. So, I mean, if we're looking at solutions to get around this, I think a lot of it comes down to poor leadership, weak leadership. That's what we've been struggling in this country since probably John Howard left office. That's a long time of having weak leadership. What from the Page Research Center perspective, what's some solutions that you would pitch? And I think you alluded to them already in your last answer, but what can we do here in this country to turn things around?
So it's interesting when I sat down day one and you sort of look at the avalanche of problems facing Australia, it can be quite overwhelming. And so really the process that we've been going through for the last 12 months is just to step back and refine what are the things that if we don't fix now means that we may not have a country in 5 to 10 years time. You know, what are the existential challenges, because there's enough of them. The first is actually our supply chain security. So we currently don't have a merchant marine fleet at all. We have no internationally flagged ships. At its peak, we had about 100. So we need to do whatever we can to get resilience into our shipping so we can ship things out and bring things in as soon as possible. That's a no-brainer. We have the Australian International Shipping Register. We have a lever that we can pull. It's just sitting there dormant. It's not being used. So that's a very quick fix that could happen tomorrow, and you could have 5, 6 ships within the next couple of years. So that's the first one, is our resilience, and then downstream from that is then our fuel security, making sure that we're stockpiling fuel, stockpiling agricultural protection products, and stockpiling our fertilizers, so that we have those reservoirs there, so that if a crisis happens, we can feed the country. That's first. Second one then is energy policy. You know, we should be declaring a state of energy emergency, because on current trajectory, electricity prices are going to increase another 50-60% over the next 10 years, and our economy does not have the flex to be able to cope with that. You will see a serious, you know, businesses shut, high streets closed, processes stopping recession if we don't fix this. And so I think, you know, tomorrow we need to give an extension to all of our coal-fired power plants. That's kind of happening by drips and drabs anyway, but the industry needs confidence that we're serious about this. It probably means building some more. And then, of course, lifting the moratorium on nuclear. And again, let the market and the battle of ideas work out what technology, what sites. Let's start that process. Let's lift the ban. It's nonsensical, but begin that process. On productivity stuff, we need to massively rein in spending. The knives need to come out some of these departments. You know, the fact that 30% of the economy is now, on the public sector pay. And if you look at the actual makeup of these, a lot of these are in admin roles. A lot of these are these kind of bureaucratic excesses that pop up. Every time you create a new law, you need someone to enforce that law. And this is how these departments balloon. So the knife needs to come out. And you need to start getting back to how do we, it's almost like innocent until proven guilty. How do we create an environment where we assume people are going to do the right thing, as opposed to assuming they're going to do the wrong thing? And so we have to micromanage and police everything they do. And if we begin to cut a lot of this regulation and bureaucracy, then you wouldn't need as many civil servants to be able to pull the strings on that. And of course, the NDIS needs to be reined in. I mean, where the NDIS per year is 1 or 2 nuclear power plants. It's crazy how much that's ballooned out of control.
Yeah.
Mass migration has to end. Just has to end. A lot of people are reluctant to do that because they say, what about the economy? Well, if you do all these other things and you get our productivity engine, you get electricity prices down and you cut regulation and you lower taxes and you make Australia a more attractive place to do business, well, then you won't need the mass migration. So, you can't do one of these in a vacuum. It needs to be a full reforming agenda. And so, we need to stop importing people en masse. I mean, I'd love to see under 100,000 per year. That feels unlikely in the near short-term future. But I think that should be the target that we're working towards, and we probably need to start approaching that target quite aggressively. And then the last thing is something we haven't really touched on here, but when you're thinking about over the next 5-10 years, who are the citizens that are going to be coming through, who are going to be saddled with this debt, who are going to be saddled with these problems? Are we producing a generation that is equipped, or are we producing a generation that is destructive? And that is, we have to get this Greens agenda on race, sex, gender, environment, our history out of our schools. And this is one of the really sad things about this country, is that all of the Greens talking points to this minority party that are almost seen as like a joke federally, but their interpretation of history, their interpretation of the environmental scare, their interpretation of sex and sexuality. That is the agenda that's being taught to all of our kids, and that really needs to be cut off. Academic standards are falling, our civics are falling, unless we have a serious U-turn in the way that we're teaching our kids. Again, we're just going to be raising another generation who are ill-equipped, uninformed, and actually perpetuating some of the structural problems that got us into this mess in the first place.
Jared, that's tremendous, and it's all just common sense stuff. Look, mate, I'd love to have you back on the show at some point in the future to flesh out more solutions, because you're doing some great work, and I encourage everyone to go to the Page Research Centre and follow what you're doing there. But, mate, we're up to the most important part of the show, the last segment. It's called Build Your Own Fantasy Government. Now, we've talked about solutions, we've talked about weak leadership. In 2025, Gerard, you have the opportunity to run the Parliament of Australia, and you can put in there 5 or 6 people to head up the next government of Australia. They can be living or dead. They don't necessarily have to be politicians. They can be anyone at all, but you need to put in there a leadership team that can take Australia into the right direction. Who do you choose?
Oh, that's okay. So I didn't know I was going to get asked this. So I'm being put on the spot, and I'm going to go away and think, oh, I should have said this. I should have said this. I should have said this. There are 3 or 4 parliamentarians in there at the moment who I think are absolutely outstanding. Andrew Hastie, I think is a future Prime Minister of this country. Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa Price, her courage, her clarity of thought. Matt Canavan, we need to protect that man at all costs and convince him to stay in Parliament for decades to come. His wisdom that he brings. So I think, do a big circle around those 3, and I think the future of common sense, they will be a part of it. If I was to draw, looking back, John Anderson, to declare my interest, he's the chairman of my board, but he was one of the reasons that I wanted to join Page, and his leadership, his clear-mindedness, his legacy of when he was leader of the National Party has been a huge inspiration to me, and so he is someone that I think should be back in there, whether he thinks it or not. Number 5. That's hard, I would have loved to have seen Peter Costello have a go at the top job.
Yeah.
I think when you look at that Howard Costello Anderson years, it's hard not to see, well, all the metrics on home ownership, on wealth, on growth, on energy affordability, on civics, on patriotism. It's hard not to see those years as being the most productive and consequential in Australia's history. I don't know enough about Menzies. I don't know enough about back at Federation, but at least in living memory, and at least since the 80s, I can't think of a more successful government. So if you put Howard or Costello back in there, John, Mr. Howard, unfortunately, is getting a little bit older, but I think Mr. Costello is still quite sharp. But I'm also consciously aware that we live in very different times, and the solutions that were required in the early 2000s on the back of an Asian manufacturing boom, off the back of a strong sense of cultural cohesion and lower migration and a greater sense of civic identity. I recognise that you can't run it back and do the same things. What this next season will require is something new. But I'd say those are some of the men and women that I really admire. And if we have to sit out and build out our 72 or 76 seats, I'd have a lot of fun, because there's a lot of other pollies who are out there at the moment and have recently retired who I think could do a good job. I think the challenge is not that we don't have amazing leaders in this country. I think the challenge is that the parliamentary system that we have, the way that's controlled by the Liberal Party and National Party head offices, well, I wouldn't say controlled by the head offices. That's probably unfair. For whatever reason, we're not getting that clear-sighted thinking and setting that agenda. And I don't know where that's coming from, whether pollsters are whispering in people's ears about you can't say this or you can't do this, or if you do this, this marginal seat might fall. But I think we're entering a time where, rather than being led by polls, we need someone who's willing to shape the polls around their agenda. And I think those 4 or 5 men or women, I think they are people who do set the agenda rather than being led by it.
It's interesting because Peter Costello is the top of my list, and he doesn't get mentioned often. He's almost forgotten about. So I think you and I are really the only two, and we've asked this question for a lot of people, and Malcolm Roberts comes up a lot, and Antic comes up a lot, and the ones that you've mentioned come up a lot as well. But Peter Costello is almost forgotten about. But I think what's interesting is what you brought up: Canavan, Jacinta Price, and Andrew Hastie, and I'd throw in Senator Antic as well. They're all of our generation. I think our generation has a very important part to play in the future of this country. And look, I really like Kevin Hogan as well. What he's doing up there in Page, I think is
yeah.
ironically.
Look, I might be biased, but I actually think the Nats benches are really strong. And Barnaby's always been a clear thinker. Bridget's a firecracker. It's a shame to see Keith Pitt go. He was what this country needs is more people who are willing to tell people the truth and not what they want to hear.
Yes.
And I think there's too many politicians who are telling people what they want to hear as opposed to what the truth is. And so yeah.
or they're driven by marketing firms instead of just going out and talking to people and hearing what they actually want. But look, mate, I've really enjoyed this one. As I said, I'd love to have you back in the future to do more. I encourage everyone to head to your website, which is page.org.au, to follow all your work and publications. Is there a way that people can sign up and be members? What's the situation?
Look, at the moment, please do subscribe. You get a semi-regular newsletter from myself. We've sort of been doing those once or twice a month, but I'm looking to transition into weekly, especially in the lead up to an election, given there's so much on. You can follow me on Twitter at Gerard G. Holland, and you can follow me on Instagram at the Gerard Holland. I'm trying to be more active there, but again, I sort of shied away from most of the spotlight for most of my life. So this is a sort of new season for me to actually do some of these things and start putting these ideas out there, and no doubt get in trouble for it. But do follow us there, and then make sure you subscribe on the website. We'd love to move towards a membership model because we want to give more value to people and we want to encourage people to donate. But it's just at the moment getting Page humming along, and all of your support is welcome. And just a quick plug. We've got a couple of papers coming out next week, an audit of the red, green and black tape, strangling our primary and secondary industries. So do look out for that. And then in mid-February, we've got another significant intervention into the energy debate, looking at the impact of rising energy prices on cost of living, the impact on Australia's GDP and the potential GDP that has been lost. And then we've got some phenomenal modelling that we partnered with a couple of firms in Queensland, forecasting what different pathways Australia could go down, be it scrapping net zero, be it a tech neutral pathway, incorporating nuclear, be it our current trajectory of renewables firmed by gas, or give the Greens and the Teals their dream, and how much a fully renewable grid would actually cost. So all of that will be coming out mid-Feb. So keep your eyes out for that as well.
No, I think you guys are going to grow in leaps and bounds based on your work so far. And look, we're organising an event in Balgowlah. We haven't confirmed the date yet, but it's likely to be in April. I'll let you know more about that as we go along. But Gerard's going to be there. He's going to be speaking. So if you are interested to hear more from him or want to meet him in person, I'll let you know more about that event in the coming weeks. But look, mate, thank you very much for coming on. I've really enjoyed this one. It's been a blast to listen to some of your insights and some of your ideas. And I encourage the audience, as I say it every single time, share this interview out. We rely on our audience to get this message out there. I'm not the best on social media, so we need you guys to whatever you need to do, put it on I've said it before, put it on a VHS tape and put it in the mail and send it to someone if you have to, but get this information out there. I think we need more discussions on these topics on how we can better Australia, and a lot of people need to be involved in those discussions. So thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you all next time.
Stephen, thanks for having me.